it's time to talk about mold. In particular, we are talking about gouache palettes that are sealable, airtight gouache palettes. This is a very popular one that you can find online, but there are many versions of it. The idea is it's got a clasp there, it's got a silicone seal inside, and it is properly airtight and leak-proof. I can wiggle this around, throw it down a cliff, which may or may not have happened, and it's not going to leak. The gouache is staying put. But because of that, we can potentially run into issues with life growing in these dark, moist little cubes.
Life finds a way.
Since I have started posting gouache videos the last couple of years, I have received endless amounts of comments about this, and usually I just explain what I do because I personally haven't experienced mold issues, but it seems a lot of people have. So I thought it might be good for me to educate myself and do a little experiment. I have several different brands of gouache I'm going to be comparing. I'm going to take some of my empty palettes, put the gouache inside them, time it for like a couple weeks each, and just see what happens. Which brands grow mold faster, or I'll do like a comparison with a palette that has some treatment in it, like a clove bud oil. I'll do some tests. It's very scientific.
Yes, I have on occasion dabbled in the scientific arts.
I will show you everything from start to finish, and you guys can see it for your own eyes and make your own conclusions. A lot of you have asked me, what happens if you leave the palette closed for weeks or months? Well, I'm going to show you my normal palette. This is my palette I use all the time, but I kind of neglected it for a while. So this is what it looks like after 4 weeks of sitting there unused. It definitely needs some TLC, but there's no mold. The dirty water or the discoloration that you see is actually dirty paint water, and because I often mix my colors in the palette, they end up being such a mess and I'm constantly having to clean them out. The main reason there's no mold in here is because I have treated it with clove bud oil, and that's a pretty common and easy thing to do, and I'll show you all about that in a moment. Some of the colors we use naturally dry out faster than others, like the earthy tones such as burnt umber. So I always have to refresh that one whenever I open it, but for the most part, they stay really creamy and usable. So if the color is really dirty, I will start with a stiff watercolor brush. This is an Etcher watercolor brush, and it's a flat one, which is good for like scooping things, and it's really stiff, so I can easily sweep it over the top of the gouache and remove any of the other colors that I accidentally mixed in there, or whatever is dirty. With my cobalt turquoise light, I usually just scoop the whole top layer off because there's extra water there, there's other colors mixed in, and it's kind of a nightmare. Even just with a few scoops, you can really start to see the original colors show through, and it feels a lot better. Just don't forget to rinse your brush every time you touch a new color. If your gouache palette is really bad, like super dirty and crusty, I do have a whole video, like a deep cleaning video. So I show like lots of close-ups and exactly how I deep clean and refresh my gouache. I mean, luckily nothing looks obviously like mold. There's nothing growing intensely in here. Once I get all of that surface discoloration off, I will go ahead and mix them very thoroughly with my palette knife and really reactivate, try to see if I can reactivate the creaminess. And while doing that, I will also add little drops of water to kind of give it a little more moisture, especially the drier colors. So like burnt umber gets really dry really fast, even when it's sealed in the palette. So that's something I always have to refresh. Now that I've stirred and refreshed all of the gouache I'm keeping, I did remove a couple of my custom colors, but anyways, now that I've done that, I'm going to clean this top edge, which gets a little bit drier, a little bit crustier. And also, if you're not careful and while you're mixing and grabbing your color, you can get a lot of color on those ridges. and then that is what will contaminate your other colors. So that's something I try to keep clean more often. But yeah, sometimes I am a little lazy with that. While I'm doing all of this, my lid is soaking in clean water. So that's gonna be refreshed as well. I find this part so satisfying. Like when you get this top edge really clean. Oh, I love it. Here's my mostly clean lid. I know my lid looks totally filthy, but that's just the color. The silicone will discolor over time, especially if you use clove bud oil. Now that my lid is clean, the last thing I'm gonna do is scrape away any of the gouache that's sitting at the top of these wells, like the top edge. And you can either try to put it back down into the well, or sometimes you just have to kind of wipe it off. But the reason for that is these little ridges on the lid slide into the square. And so if there's gouache sitting at the top of that square, it might squeeze out into the other squares, or most likely it'll just stick to the lid and get your lid super crusty and you just have to constantly clean your lid. So if you know, you don't have to do it with every single thing, but like here, the red is really built up on the edge of that. So I'm just gonna try to push it down at least a little. I'm probably gonna clean out those wells I removed the colors from, completely clean those out, but just for the purpose of this demonstration, what I do after it's all ready to be closed and put away, I will give it a light dusting of the clove solution. Let me show you the clove bud oil I use. I just bought it online, and it's clove bud oil, not clove oil. Clove bud oil is much stronger, so you need less of it. What I do is, this was full, but I fill this little water bottle with water, and then I drop maybe like 10 drops of the clove bud oil, pretty much just enough so I can see it swirling around inside, and it is discolored a little bit because the clove bud oil is that color. And then I'm gonna let it sit for maybe like 10 minutes. Before I close it, I will spray the lid just very, very lightly. And if you don't want any excess water sitting in any of your colors, because again, that is what is going to contribute to mold growth if that's one of your problems, if that's happening to you. Mold likes moist, warm, sometimes dark environments. So if you remove those conditions, you'll be much better off. The thing is, with the clove bud oil, you want to use as little as possible. When I first filled my gouache palette, I filled it like all the way to the top almost, leaving just enough room for the lid to go on. And I put 1 drop of clove bud oil in each color, and I mixed very thoroughly. And that kept my gouache palette like perfect for so long, for months and months and months. Now that my colors are dwindling, and some of these are the original colors that I haven't even had to refresh, so I know that there's still clove bud oil in them, I don't want to introduce too much more, because too much of that is going to alter the way the paint behaves. I'll only add just a tiny hint of this, like just dusting it over the surface, if I know I'm going to be closing this for a while. And then the next time I open it, again, I might have to refresh a little bit, but if I know I'm going to be using my palette like at least once a week, I don't add any clove bud oil because I don't need it. This is really like more of a preventative thing if you know you are not using your palette that often. The point of having a gouache palette like this is to make life easier, to encourage you to paint more often. So maybe question why you aren't using it. And if you don't use your gouache that often, just keep it in the tube. Don't bother with this palette unless you're gonna be like traveling or painting outside, because it does require maintenance. You can't just let it sit forever. Okay, so as I said, I'm gonna let this sit for maybe 5-10 minutes, just let a little bit of that excess moisture evaporate, and then I'm gonna close it up. Okay, let's talk about ways you can keep your palette mold-free. And some of these are things that I've done naturally over the years without realizing it, but I hope that they will help you. First of all, I think it comes down to cleanliness, and I don't mean to like insult anyone. I am definitely a very messy painter. I'm not the most careful, but things like using a clean water source, using clean brushes, and you can either use distilled water or not. I have never used distilled water when I paint and never had issues. But I do clean out my water dish regularly, and I also clean my brushes. So not only do I rinse them thoroughly, but once in a while I will use the Master's brush cleaner. This is like a brush cleaner, soap, and preserver, they say. Even on my synthetic brushes, it just kind of gets all of the built up stuff out of my brushes. I've even used seawater in my palette and didn't have issues for the weeks following. So I already showed you my clove bud oil technique. And again, I want to emphasize, use as little as possible, as infrequently as possible. I don't want to hear any comments that someone put a ton of oil in their palette and now their gouache is like super gooey and runny. Like just use as little as possible. Another good maintenance tip is to open your palette at least once a week. Give each color a little stir. If you want to, you can air it out just slightly, but obviously don't let it dry out completely because that defeats the purpose. And obviously before stirring it, make sure that there's nothing like growing on the surface of each color. If you notice like a little film or any kind of weird discoloration, remove that with a brush or with a paper towel or a palette knife, anything. Try to keep the surface of each color clean. That will at least help you kind of monitor the color of each gouache and make sure there's nothing weird growing on each one. If you don't plan on using your gouache palette like at least once every couple weeks, really reconsider why you're even keeping it. Ultimately, your gouache will be much better off and last longer in the original tubes. So, just kind of weigh that. To me, the reason for these stay wet palettes is to make it convenient to paint in other locations. So I paint outside a lot, and that I can just grab it, throw it in my bag, and go. But if you're more of a studio painter, maybe consider a stay wet palette. You can make your own stay wet palette. I use one by Redgrass, and they come with a little sponge inside. You keep this wet, and then you put your palette paper on top, and when you're done painting, you mix on there, but when you're done painting, you close it and you seal it shut. So you can keep using this week after week if you want. I've kept gouache wet and usable in here for a month before. Just squeeze out the gouache that you need for a session or a couple sessions and paint with it for a few days. And then when you're done, you can remove the paper and set this aside until the next time you want to use it. And you won't have to like constantly maintain it. Although, just as a word of warning, in any stay wet palette you use, don't ever leave the wet sponge inside for like a super long time without opening it, letting some fresh air in and checking on it, because anytime you seal a wet thing into a dark area and that has like stagnant air, you are providing an environment for mold. Lastly, if you're still having trouble with mold in your palette, maybe consider keeping this in the refrigerator between uses. I don't suggest freezing it because I think that could potentially lead to cracks and issues, but refrigerator would be fine. If you live with children or non-artists, maybe put a label on it that says paint, do not eat. You don't want anyone thinking that this is like colorful hummus. But it may give you some extra time between uses where you don't really have to worry as much. Now that my normal palette is taken care of, I'm going to set this aside for a while for the same amount of time that I do the other experiments. I've pulled out all of my airtight palettes. I have quite a few of them, and I'm going to fill these with all of the other brands of gouache I bought. I'm going to consult my gouache database so I make sure I have all of the brands covered. I'm going to isolate each brand in the palette by separating it with a couple empty wells, and luckily these types of palettes actually have a very tight seal. So around every single well, the silicone actually presses down into it, so no air or liquid can escape or get through, at least in my palettes. Maybe some of them out there aren't quite as good, but it'll work for this experiment where each color is kind of its own environment. Some colors are actually more prone to mold than others, like rose or like pinkish tones. I've heard that those are much worse. Another thing about my mold test is that I'm not using every single color I bought. I'm only picking a few from each brand. Because they'll be isolated in the palette, it will be fine, and it will allow me to use the gouache for my tests and painting comparisons while this is happening in the background. So in the coming weeks, I'll be sharing my reviews of each brand, and I'll also do a huge, big, long video with all of the brands compared side by side and my thoughts about it and how each one felt, because I think that that's valuable in itself to hear about the experience of painting with each one after another. So all of the footage you're watching here, it's kind of like my first impressions of each gouache as well, and those will be included in each brand's review. I hope that made sense. I have the brand and the color names written here, and I'm gonna add a piece of tape each time I check it. So we started at February 9th. Next time I'll do another piece of tape and say checked on whatever, and then I'll make my notes in the gouache database. Okay, we have 6 more brands that we need to fit into these palettes. Another thing I want to mention is that in my mold experiments, as soon as I start noticing something growing on the gouache, that's when I consider the mold to have started. And because I'll be checking it frequently, I'm hoping I'll be able to stop it in its tracks. I'll be able to scrape it off, and I'll hopefully be able to use the gouache. I don't imagine any one of these is gonna end up being like completely unusable, so I won't be wasting all of the gouache in these palettes. I'm definitely gonna use it. In addition, all of the tubes of gouache or the brands that I really don't end up using in my normal paintings, I'll be saving those for future workshops. So when people come to my workshops, maybe they've never heard of gouache or they traveled and they couldn't bring it with them, I'll just have a big pile of it that they can choose from and be able to play with. Let's put these on the shelf where everything else goes. This is where I typically keep my palettes. Kind of dark over there, but yeah, I'm just keeping it the same as usual. Goodbye, gouache. See you in a week. A lot of you have asked me over the years, like, if I could try some of the more affordable, the cheaper brands like Arteza or Miyahime, and I never really had interest in it, but I think this mold test was the thing, it was the catalyst I needed to just go ahead and buy it, because now I'm like seriously curious how it's going to perform in this test, but I also get to use it. So I get to do a little gouache review, a gouache comparison, and just learn a ton. I think this is going to be good for me as someone who speaks about gouache openly to the public, to the world. It's going to help me be able to speak about it more informed than before and answer questions when they pop up in my comments. So if you're interested in my ramblings about all of the different gouache brands, make sure you subscribe before you go. For all of my fellow gouache nerds out there, if you're interested in all of this, I'm going to compile everything I learn, everything I find, on a new page on my blog called the Gouache Database. And so I'll have like each brand, the prices, where they're manufactured, what is in the binder. And by the way, I'm actually emailing and speaking to these companies to confirm what is in their binders, because I don't believe what I read online. I want to hear it directly from the company. And yeah, just anything else I find interesting about each brand. In addition, I'm going to do individual blog posts and videos about each brand. So as I kind of go through and test each one and experiment and do paintings with each one, I'm going to share my experience. It's not gonna just be about like the technical thing, the quality of the pigment or all of that. It's gonna be, what is the experience like painting with this? Okay, I'm not gonna keep going on and on about it. I'll put all the links in the description for anyone who's curious about all that. I'm currently doing all of the swatching and testing and painting with the various brands and recording it all and writing the blog posts now, which is going to take a while. It's going to take at least a few weeks. By the time I'm done editing and uploading and preparing everything to be shared with you all, probably about 4 or 5 weeks will have passed where the gouache is just sitting in these pallets, and then I can open them and kind of see how it's going. I will probably open each one once a week just to see and kind of monitor how things are going, but I won't touch it, I won't mess with it. I just really want to get a feel for what each brand does in these pallets. So obviously I won't be able to share the mold test results right away. It's going to take a while. It just naturally takes time. In the meantime, I'll start posting the review videos. I'll also eventually do a big comparison video of all of these brands side by side and give you a little more insights about, you know, what were they like using compared to each other and all of that. If you learned something or you found this video helpful or amusing, definitely give it a thumbs up to show YouTube that I'm doing a pretty good job. And if you like gouache, subscribe before you go. All right, I'm gonna go do some gouache things, I guess. Thanks for watching. Take care.